The first hostile volley in what would rapidly escalate into a neighborhood siege arrived not as a shouted ultimatum, but as a stiff, cream-colored rectangle official, and vaguely menacing nestled amongst the innocuous bills and flyers in Captain Mark Olson's mailbox. It bore the embossed, slightly pretentious crest of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. Mark, head of the city's esteemed K-9 unit, recognized it with an instant familiar weariness that settled upon his broad shoulders even before he'd slit it open. He knew that seal, and he knew with a sinking feeling that tasted like stale coffee and impending conflict the probable architect of any pronouncements it contained, Deardra Smith, their immediate next-door neighbor, and the HOA's self-appointed iron-fisted scourge. Inside the letter, typed in an unforgivingly sharp sans serif font that seemed to brook no argument, was precisely as officious and irritating as he'd braced himself for. It was a formal notification of violation regarding animal nuisance excessive barking. Attributed to Bullet Mark's retired OCPD K-9 partner, complaints have been received and duly documented. It declared citing persistent and unreasonably loud barking, significantly disturbing the peace and quiet enjoyment of neighboring residents. It mentioned photographic evidence and time-stamped audio recordings, and pointedly reminded Mark that as a respected member of law enforcement, he above all residents should be cognizant of and committed to upholding community regulations. Urums. Rectification was mandated immediately with threats of escalating daily financial penalties, $50 day accruing, formal mediation at your expense, and potential legal recourse. It was signed with firm expectation of your prompt and unequivocal compliance. By Deardra M. Smith, Ms. Chairperson, CCNR Enforcement Committee. Mark let the letter drift to the granite kitchen counter, a low, frustrated sigh escaping him. Bullet, his loyal old partner, now a gentle retiree whose most strenuous activity was a slow amble to his food bowl, barely let out a woof, unless someone came directly to the door. Excessive barking. This was classic Deardra, manufacturing a complaint, twisting facts, all to assert her petty dominance, and wield her sliver of HOA power. The time-stamped audio recordings were likely Deardra herself, lurking by their fence with a microphone, if Bullet happened to let out a single bark at a passing squirrel. The jab about his profession, implying he was derelict in his community duties, was particularly galling. He was still rereading the thinly veiled accusations, a muscle tightening in his jaw, when the doorbell chimed, an incongruously cheerful melodic sound. He opened it to find Deardra Smith herself standing on his porch. A tight, insincere smile plastered on her face, a covered casserole dish clutched in her hands, its floral pattern clashing with her severe gray suit. "Mark, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that immediately set his teeth on edge. "I was just on my way to the HOA strategy session. So much to prepare for the upcoming beautification awards, and I saw your car. I do hope I'm not disturbing you at an inconvenient hour." "Deardra," Mark said, his voice carefully neutral, one hand still holding her accusatory letter, the paper crinkling slightly in his grip. "What can I do for you?" "Oh, nothing official, not right now, of course." She chirped, her small, hard eyes flicking past him into the house with unnerving speed, then back to his face, assessing, Well, Agnes Albright happened to mention that your lovely Sarah is expecting such wonderful, wonderful news, a true blessing, and I know things have been a little, shall we say, strained between us with the unfortunate barking issue from your rather energetic shepherd." She made a small, dismissive gesture with her free hand. "I just wanted to bring over a little something, my grandmother's famous tuna noodle casserole, a small token of neighborly goodwill, comfort food, you know." She thrust the dish at him, its warmth radiating through the thin dish towel, and to say personally how truly thrilled I am for you both. Children are such a precious gift, a sacred joy. The whiplash from the vitriolic threatening letter to this saccharine, almost unctuous display of feigned bonhomie was dizzying. Thank you, Deardra," Mark said reluctantly, taking the unwanted casserole. "That's very thoughtful of you." He felt like he was handling a poorly disguised explosive device. "Not at all, not at all." She said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, which held a strange, assessing, almost covetous glint, as they again flickered towards the interior of his home, as if searching for something or someone. "We must all endeavor to be good neighbors, mustn't we? To foster harmony, especially with a precious new life about to grace our little community. To give Sarah my very, very best. And perhaps," she added her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial, cloying whisper, "we can have a more amicable chat later, just you and I, about finding a quieter, more considerate routine for Bullet, for the sake of overall neighborhood tranquility, you understand." And of course, her gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly, for Sarah's continued peace of mind and well-being during this delicate and important time. She patted his arm, a gesture that felt more like a calculated claim than a friendly comfort, then turned with a brisk, self-important swivel and marched off down his walkway, her back ramrod straight, a woman on a mission. Mark closed the door, a profound sense of unease, cold and sharp, settling over him. This was worse, far worse than her usual overt aggression, this feigned friendliness. This sudden cloying, almost obsessive interest in Sarah's pregnancy felt deeply unsettling, manipulative, almost predatory. He placed the casserole on the counter, his appetite, if he'd had any, completely gone. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This felt personal, targeted, and deeply sinister. "Another billet due from our charming neighbor, I presume?" Sarah's voice, warm and laced with a familiar amusement, came from the living room doorway. She entered, her hand resting protectively, instinctively on her burgeoning belly. At 7 months pregnant with their eagerly anticipated daughter, Lily Sarah radiated a serene, luminous beauty, her eyes sparkling with an inner joy that even Deardra's machinations couldn't entirely dim, and a personal appearance, believe it or not, Mark said, handing her the letter, then recounting Deardra's bizarre, unsettling visit, complete with tuna casserole and a deeply unconvincing performance of concern for your delicate condition. Sarah's eyebrows arched as she read the letter. Then a small frown creased her forehead, as Mark described Deardra's demeanor. "Deardra Smith concerned, and bringing food. That's more than alarming, Mark. That's downright terrifying." She chuckled softly, a nervous sound but a flicker of genuine unease mirroring his own crossed her usually tranquil face. Still, maybe she's genuinely trying to turn over a new leaf. People can change, can't they? "With Deardra Smith," Mark said grimly, the memory of that strange, assessing glint in her eyes replaying in his mind. "There's always an angle, always a hidden agenda. And I have a very bad feeling this new leaf is poison ivy." He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this letter, this bizarre visit, was not an isolated incident, but a calculated, ominous prelude to something far more dangerous. Their evening stroll, usually a cherished ritual of quiet connection and shared dreams, now felt slightly charged, almost furtive. Oakhaven Estates, typically an idyll of manicured lawns, the distant melodic laughter of children playing in backyards, the gentle sigh of the wind through the mature oak and maple trees, and the occasional cheerful chime of a neighbor's wind sculpture seemed to hold its breath, a palpable tension hanging in the warm spring air as they approached the invisible hostile perimeter around Deardra Smith's property. The air around her house number 216 always hummed with a low-grade, unspoken animosity, amplified today by the intermittent, guttural, menacing barks of Thor and Loki, her two formidable, notoriously poorly socialized pitbulls, as they passed Mrs. Albright's meticulously tended garden 2 doors down from Deardra's fortress of negativity. The elderly woman was carefully deadheading her prize-winning hybrid tea roses, her movements precise and economical, despite her advancing age. Agnes Albright was a neighborhood institution, a respected elder with a sharp wit, a kind heart, and an almost encyclopedic knowledge of Oakhaven's complex social dynamics and its inhabitants' various foibles. "Evening, Mark, Sarah dear." Mrs. Albright called out, her smile genuine and welcoming, though her usually bright eyes held a hint of discernible worry as they flicked almost involuntarily towards Deardra's silent, shuttered house. "My Sarah, you're simply glowing, positively radiant. Little Lily will be here before we know it, bringing joy to us all." "Good evening, Agnes," Mark replied, appreciating her warmth, a small pocket of normalcy in the otherwise unsettling atmosphere. "She certainly will. We're counting the days. Just be extra vigilant around Deardra's place today, my dears." Mrs. Albright said, her voice dropping conspiratorially, her gaze sweeping the street as if to ensure they weren't overheard. She was in a right foul and peculiar mood earlier. Her dogs, Thor and Loki, went after young Timmy Henderson on his little red scooter. Didn't actually bite him, thank the good Lord, but scared the poor lad half to death, sent him tumbling Deardra instead of apologizing or even checking on the child. Just stood on her porch and laughed. Said it would toughen him up for the cruel world. Can you imagine? Agnes shook her head, her expression a mixture of profound exasperation and genuine concern. And then she leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. She was muttering something quite vicious and unpleasant about some people flaunting their unearned fertility like broodmares when she saw young Mrs. Henderson walking by with her new baby carriage. Actually said right out loud, "Some get everything, all the blessings, while others get nothing but heartache and emptiness." It was chilling, Mark. Truly chilling. That woman, she carries a deep, dark, festering well of bitterness inside her. Especially, I've always suspected about children, about happy families. Never had any of her own. You know, a very sad, very short, and apparently quite acrimonious marriage, many, many years ago, ended badly. No children from it, makes a person hard, I suppose. Or in her case, perhaps just plain mean, right through to the bone. Mark exchanged a troubled, significant look with Sarah. Deardra's palpable animosity towards children, or perhaps more accurately towards the perceived happiness and fulfillment of families, was a disturbing undercurrent he'd vaguely sensed over the years, but never had confirmed with such stark, unsettling detail. Mrs. Albright's words cast a new, more sinister, and deeply alarming light on their already unpleasant and unpredictable neighbor's personality. It wasn't just about petty HOA power plays or a general misanthropy anymore. It might be rooted in something far deeper, far more painful, and potentially far more volatile and dangerous. "Thanks for the warning, Agnes." Mark said, his jaw tight, a cold knot of apprehension forming in his stomach. "We'll definitely steer clear and be extra careful." "You do that, dears, and congratulations again. A baby is a true precious miracle. Don't let anyone spoil that joy for you." Agnes gave Sarah's arm a gentle, reassuring squeeze before turning back to her roses, her expression troubled. As they neared Deardra's property, the very air seemed to crackle with a familiar, palpable animosity. Thor and Loki were predictably in the front yard, their powerful muscular bodies taut with aggression, a low, rumbling, continuous growl emanating from their chests like distant thunder as they paced relentlessly along the inside of the wrought iron fence line, their unblinking yellow eyes fixed on Mark and Sarah. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Mark, her hand finding his and gripping it tightly. "Easy, boys." Mark said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of quiet authority, his professional K-9 handler's eyes constantly on the dogs, assessing their escalating agitation, their body language, the subtle shifts in their posture. He carefully, deliberately positioned himself slightly between Sarah and the menacing animals. Just as they were about to cross the street to give Deardra's house a wide berth, her front door creaked open, and Deardra herself emerged, not with her usual smug, proprietary scowl, but with that same unsettlingly sweet, almost predatory smile she'd worn during her bizarre casserole delivery earlier that day. Mark, Sarah. What a delightful surprise to see you out enjoying this glorious evening. She called out, her voice unnaturally honeyed like poisoned syrup. I was just about to sit down on the porch with a tall, refreshing glass of my homemade lemonade. Please, you simply must join me. We can have that little chat about Dear Bullet, and you can tell me all about your exciting plans for the new baby. I'm just dying to hear all the details. She unlatched her front gate with a flourish, swinging it wide open, an inviting gesture that felt deeply, profoundly wrong. Come in, don't be strangers. The boys, she cooed, gesturing towards Thor and Loki, who had suddenly unnervingly fallen silent, their gazes still locked on Sarah. Are just dying to meet you properly. They're really just big slobbery pussycats once they get to know you and realize you're not a threat. Mark's internal alarms, already on high alert, now screamed a deafening cacophony. This was too much, too false, too out of character even for Deardra's erratic behavior. That's incredibly generous of you, Deardra. Mark said, his voice carefully neutral, stalling for time, desperately trying to assess the rapidly evolving, deeply unsettling situation. But Sarah's feeling a bit tired this evening. We were just on our way back home, actually. Oh, nonsense, pure nonsense. Deardra insisted, her smile unwavering, though her eyes held that peculiar, almost feverish, obsessive glint he'd seen before. A glint that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Just for a few minutes, I absolutely insist. It's so very rare we get a chance to be truly neighborly, to connect on a personal level. And I have those lovely new wicker porch chairs I've been absolutely dying to show off. So comfortable. For some. She gestured them inside with an almost theatrical, irresistible sweep of her arm, an invitation that felt more like a carefully laid trap, a summons they dared not refuse. Without risking an immediate, unpredictable explosion, Mark felt utterly dangerously trapped. Refusing outright might provoke an immediate, unpleasant, and potentially volatile public scene. Accepting felt like willingly, foolishly walking into a spider's intricately spun, venomous web. He glanced at Sarah, whose eyes, wide with a mixture of apprehension and confusion, mirrored his own profound unease, but who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, clearly wanting to avoid a direct confrontation to placate their increasingly unpredictable neighbor. "All right, Deardra," Mark said, forcing a strained, unconvincing smile, his gut churning with a nameless dread. "Just for a little while? Then thank you." He took Sarah's arm, his grip unconsciously tightening, and together with a shared sense of deep foreboding, they stepped through the open gate into Deardra Smith's meticulously kept yet strangely sterile, unnervingly silent front yard. The dogs Thor and Loki were on the porch, now loosely tethered to a porch railing, with what looked like brand new, suspiciously thin nylon leashes. They were quiet now, unnervingly, so their unblinking obsidian gazes fixed on Sarah, particularly on her swollen, vulnerable abdomen, a low, almost inaudible growl, more a vibration than a sound, rumbled deep in Thor's massive chest. Deardra ushered them onto the porch with an almost manic energy, fussing over the placement of chairs, offering cushions with an exaggerated solicitude. She poured them tall glasses of lemonade from a heavy crystal pitcher, her movements a little too bright, a little too eager, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. For several excruciating, surreal minutes, she engaged them in an unnervingly solicitous, almost suffocatingly intimate conversation, asking about baby names, prospective due dates, nursery color schemes, her voice dripping with an artificial, cloying sweetness that was almost physically nauseating. Mark answered curtly, his senses on high alert, every nerve-ending screaming danger, his gaze constantly flicking between the dogs, their unnervingly focused stares, and Deardra, her too bright smile, her restless hands. Sarah, though clearly deeply uncomfortable and increasingly anxious, played along with admirable composure, her responses polite but brief, her hand never leaving her belly. Then Deardra stood up abruptly, her smile widening into something that looked almost like a predatory rictus, her eyes glittering with a strange, feverish light. "Oh, goodness me, the sun is just absolutely perfect in the back garden this time of day, and the boys do so adore chasing those pesky squirrels back there. Let me just unclip them from these restrictive porch tethers so they can have a proper, vigorous run in the fully fenced backyard. They get so dreadfully bored and antsy on these short leashes, the poor darlings." She moved towards the dogs, cooing at them in a strange, high-pitched voice. Mark tensed, a primal, ice-cold instinct screaming at him that something terrible, something irreversible was about to happen. He saw her fingers go to the shiny new leash clips. He saw, with a sudden, sickening clarity, a thin, almost invisible strand of heavy-gauge fishing line looped around both metal clips, its other end leading to her right hand, which was now subtly, almost imperceptibly concealed behind her back. A tripwire, a goddamned premeditated tripwire. "Deardra, wait." Mark began, his voice a low growl, starting to rise from his chair, every muscle in his body coiling ready to spring. But it was too late. Her eyes, no longer feigning friendliness or neighborly concern, locked onto Sarah's vulnerable pregnant form with an expression of pure, unadulterated, almost ecstatic venom. "I lost every chance I ever had for a child, for a family, for this kind of happiness." Deardra hissed, her voice suddenly raw, cracking with decades of accumulated bitterness, envy, and profound, inconsolable grief. "You think you deserve this smug contentment, flaunting your fertile belly in my face day after day after day, when I was left with nothing but emptiness and heartache. You think you're better than me." With a sharp, vicious, almost orgasmic tug on the concealed fishing line, both leash clips sprang open simultaneously with a sickening click. "Thor, Loki, go say hello to the baby." She shrieked, her face a mask of contorted rage and triumphant, demonic malice. "Show her what it means to lose something precious. Make her understand." The dogs unleashed and clearly incited by her agitated state. Her piercing shriek and her sharp, aggressive command exploded from the porch like a nightmare, unleashed a blur of brindled and black muscle teeth, bared eyes burning with a terrifying, focused intensity. They weren't barking. They were silent, deadly, their movements low and predatory. Their target was unmistakable. Sarah. Time warped, stretched, then fractured into a million horrifying slow-motion shards. Mark saw the dogs charging a combined, unstoppable mass of snarling, frenzied muscle. He heard Sarah's scream, a high, thin, piercing sound of pure, abject terror that ripped through him like a physical blow, shattering the suburban quiet. He saw the utter, uncomprehending fear on her beautiful face, the instinctive, desperate way she tried to shield her precious belly. In that infinitesimal, almost immeasurable sliver of a second, before conscious thought could fully form, before fear could paralyze years of intensive K-9 training, of facing down raw, unbridled aggression, of protecting his partners, of defending the innocent, surged through Mark's veins like a jolt of pure adrenaline. There was no room for fear, no space for hesitation. There was only the absolute, primal, unshakable imperative to act to protect, to neutralize the imminent lethal threat. His voice, when it came, was not a shout of human anger, but the deep, resonant, utterly commanding, almost inhuman bark he used with his highly trained working dogs, a sound honed by countless thousands of hours on the training field. A sound that cut through the chaos, through the terror like a whip crack. A sound that demanded instant, unthinking obedience. Aus, Platz down. The German command's sharp explosive delivered with an iron, unwavering authority that seemed to vibrate in the very air to physically push against the charging animals. Thor, the larger, more dominant brindle, actually faltered for a crucial microsecond, his head tilting almost imperceptibly, a flicker of confusion, of ingrained response to a command tone, momentarily overriding his bloodlust. Loki, however, younger, more frenzied, less responsive to any authority. But Deardra's hate barely broke stride, lunging directly for Sarah. Mark thrust himself directly into the path of the oncoming dogs, a human shield, a desperate living barrier between unspeakable violence and his beloved wife and unborn child. He knew the terrible risks. A determined pitbull bite could be devastating, crippling, even fatal. But the thought of those powerful, crushing jaws closing on Sarah, on Lily, was infinitely more terrifying, a prospect too horrific to contemplate. Loki reached him first, launching himself not at Mark's legs but with terrifying agility, higher towards Mark's outstretched arm, as he tried to push Sarah behind him. Loki's teeth clamped down hard on Mark's left forearm, a searing, blinding flash of agony. Mark felt the sickening crunch of teeth meeting bone, felt the warm, slick gush of his own blood. He roared, not in pain but in pure K-9 command fury. He used the dog's momentum, twisting, slamming Loki against the porch railing, trying to break the hold, but the dog was locked on, shaking its head savagely. Thor, recovering from his momentary hesitation, his predatory instincts reasserting themselves, renewed his charge, aiming for Mark's already compromised side, trying to get past him to Sarah, who had stumbled backwards, a choked sob escaping her lips as she saw the blood pouring from Mark's arm. "Sarah, get back! Get inside! Call 911 now!" "Do!" Mark yelled, his voice strained with effort and pain, as he grappled with Thor, trying to protect his injured arm, trying to keep the powerful, snarling animal from reaching Sarah, though paralyzed with a terror so profound it threatened to swallow her whole, fumbled desperately for her phone. Her fingers slick with sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Deardra Smith stood on her porch, a few feet away, her face a mask of shocked, almost imbecilic disbelief. The initial triumphant demonic malice now rapidly being replaced by a dawning, horrified realization of the sheer, uncontrollable ferocity she had unleashed. It was clear she hadn't anticipated the bloody reality of her dog's attack, or Mark's tenacious, skilled, and utterly fearless intervention. Perhaps she had envisioned her dog simply scaring them, teaching them a lesson, asserting her twisted dominance in the most brutal, terrifying way imaginable, but not this mauling. Mark wrestled with Thor, the dog's hot, fetid breath on his face, its teeth snapping inches from his eyes. He managed to get his good arm, his right arm under Thor's powerful jaw, pushing upwards with all his strength, trying to create leverage to keep those teeth away from his throat. He knew with a terrifying certainty that he couldn't maintain this desperate, bloody defensive posture for long against two determined, powerful, enraged animals. He needed to regain control to go on the offensive, to establish dominance in a way they understood, and he needed to do it now before he lost consciousness from blood loss, before they got to Sarah. He could hear faintly through the red haze of pain and adrenaline the distant, approaching wail of sirens. Sarah had gotten through. "Thank God! Mark, oh God, Mark, your arm!" Sarah cried, her voice choked with terror and anguish, but she was backing away, moving towards the relative safety of the street phone, still clutched in her hand, her eyes wide with horror. "It's okay, Sarah. Just keep moving back. Get help," he yelled, never taking his eyes off the dogs. Loki was still latched onto his bleeding forearm, worrying it like a chew toy. The pain, a sickening, throbbing wave. Thor was relentlessly trying to circle him to get to Sarah. This was a coordinated, vicious attack, fueled by raw, unrestrained aggression and Deardra's hateful incitement. His K-9 training, his deep understanding of K-9 pack dynamics and aggression triggers, was all that stood between his family and utter catastrophe. He knew he couldn't truly subdue both dogs in the conventional sense without risking even more serious injury to himself or to them, which in turn could further escalate their uncontrollable aggression. His only hope was to interrupt the attack pattern, to create enough confusion and hesitation in the animals to allow Sarah to get to complete safety and for armed backup to arrive. The seconds stretched into an eternity of blood pain and roaring. He feinted a movement towards Loki with his injured arm, a desperate gamble causing the dog to momentarily adjust its grip, then refocused his dominant, unwavering stare on Thor, who was still growling, lunging, but hadn't managed to get a solid hold. "Aus Platz, stand down!" he roared again, pouring every ounce of his remaining strength, his will, his authority into the commands, the force of his voice seeming to physically push against the dogs. Thor, faced with this unyielding, bleeding, but terrifyingly indomitable human obstacle, who showed no fear, only an almost palpable aura of absolute, unwavering command, hesitated again, a low, uncertain whine now mixed with the growl in his chest. The forward momentum of his attack visibly significantly lessened Loki, too, perhaps sensing the shift in his packmate, or reacting to the sheer overwhelming force of Mark's voice, loosened his grip on Mark's arm for a crucial instant. It was the break Mark desperately needed. He twisted, yanking his mauled arm free, ignoring the fresh surge of agony, and then with a surprising burst of adrenaline-fueled agility, he scrambled to his feet, blood streaming down his arm, staining his shirt, dripping onto the pristine porch. He put himself squarely, defiantly between the now momentarily hesitant dogs and Sarah, who was being helped away by the first responding officer, Ramirez. The first Oakhaven police patrol car screamed around the corner, its lights flashing siren cutting through the suburban quiet like a banshee's wail. The sight and sound of the approaching vehicle, another unexpected, overwhelming element in their predatory focus, seemed to further unsettle the dogs, who now looked confused, their aggression momentarily muted by uncertainty. Two uniformed officers, Officer Ramirez and her partner, Officer Chen, their faces grim, their service weapons drawn but pointed safely downwards, began to cautiously, tactically approach Ramirez, her eyes wide with shock and concern as she took in Mark's injuries, and Sarah's terrified state spoke first. "Captain Olson! Sir, are you all right, Mrs. Olson? Are you hurt?" Ramirez called out, her voice tight with professional concern, but also a hint of personal dismay. "I remember you both from the Coffee with a Cop event at the community center last fall. Mrs. Olson." She added, her voice softening for Sarah. "You were asking about the department's youth outreach program. You and the captain are good people. We'll take care of this. What happened?" "Suspect is Deardra Smith, owner of these animals," Mark yelled back, his voice hoarse, gesturing with his good hand towards Deardra, who was now frozen on her porch, a statue of dawning, abject horror, the full catastrophic consequences of her actions finally crashing down upon her. "She intentionally, premeditatedly released them to attack my wife. Sarah is 7 months pregnant. Secure the suspect immediately. I need animal control here. Stat, these dogs are evidence of a violent felony." With the arrival of his armed colleagues, Mark felt a fraction of the immense, crushing pressure lift. He could now focus entirely on keeping the dogs contained, preventing further attacks, until specialized animal control units arrived. He maintained his commanding, albeit bloodied stance, his voice periodically booming out, calming but firm orders, not just to the dogs, but to his approaching officers, guiding them on how to position themselves safely to create a secure zone and manage the still unpredictable animals. Deardra Smith seeing the police cars swarming her street, the drawn weapons, the grim, determined faces of the officers. The blood on Mark's arm finally seemed to grasp the full, irreversible enormity of what she had done. Her face moments before, alight with malicious, triumphant glee, was now a mask of pasty, fearful, self-pitying shock. She started to stammer, her voice barely a whisper. It was an accident. The leashes. They must have been faulty. They just came open. They're usually so gentle. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Mark shot her a look of pure, unadulterated, weary contempt. Save your pathetic lies, Deardra. I saw what you did. Your neighbors saw what you did. And most importantly, your intended victim, my wife, saw and heard exactly what you did, what you said. He gestured toward Sarah, who was now being gently but firmly guided further away from the scene by Officer Ramirez, who was murmuring reassurances and shielding her from the worst of the unfolding chaos. The immediate life-threatening crisis was passing, but the adrenaline still coursed through Mark's veins like fire. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from the sheer brutal intensity of the confrontation, the narrowness of their escape, the sickening realization of Deardra's calculated evil. His left arm throbbed with an almost unbearable, searing pain, and his leg ached where Loki had gripped it through his jeans. But Sarah, his precious, beloved Sarah and Lily, their cherished unborn daughter, were safe. That was all that mattered. That was everything. But as he looked at Deardra Smith, her carefully constructed world now visibly crumbling around her, her face contorting into a pathetic display of self-pity and feigned bewilderment, as Officer Chen approached her purposefully with handcuffs, a cold, hard, righteous rage tempered by a profound, weary sadness for the consuming bitterness that had so clearly destroyed her humanity, settled deep in Mark's heart. This wasn't just about aggressive dogs or a negligent owner or even a petty HOA dispute. This was a deliberate, malicious, premeditated assault born of a twisted, deep-seated pain and a monstrous, hateful envy. And Deardra Smith, he vowed, was going to answer for it, every last damning bit of it.